Welcome everyone to another episode of our podcast AdBites, where we lift the lid on all things Apple search ads. This podcast is brought to you by Redbox Mobile, an award-winning ASO and ASO company. I'm your host, Samuel Chorlton. I'm the CTO at Redbox Mobile, and I'm joined on today's call by industry expert Simon Thillay from AppTweak, where we will be discussing how ASO insights inform and improve Apple search ads performance. Simon, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before we start.
Hey, yeah, thanks Sam for having me, and hello everyone. So the name's already on the screen, but about myself, what the audience may not know. So I've been doing ASO for some 5 or 6 years now. It's becoming harder to count. I basically started my career at Deezer, music streaming service based in France, where I was doing ASO, a bit of SEO and attribution as well. And then in the summer of 2019, I moved to Belgium to join AppTweak, which is an ASO, ASO and more now, tool, platform, and also offering services to some of our clients. And I've been basically leading our efforts to expand our knowledge in ASO, as well as offering concrete services in terms of support for how to improve ASO performance.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. So hopefully everyone by the end of today's session, if you're not clear, you'll have a good idea on what ASO is and also have a bit of a sense as to how ASO feeds into Apple search ads and how the two can kind of work together. So we're going to start off with a fairly kind of straightforward question, but an important point to start. Simon, so I guess if you could start off with a bit of an explanation as to what ASO is, would be really helpful.
Sure. So usually I have this formal definition of ASO, which is that it's the process of improving an app's visibility and appeal to App Store users throughout the app's lifetime. And more concretely, what that means that ASO covers any and all changes you might make to your App Store page. That starts with keywords, which is what most people associate it with, but it also covers a lot more. For instance, creative optimization, reviews and ratings management, custom pages, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot today, in-app events, and even more now.
So I guess to provide a short bit of context to it, the ASO data itself is what the user sees within the Apple App Store, correct? Yeah.
Yes. So there are a couple of things that developers are able to do that don't get spotted immediately by users. One of them is adding a few keywords in what is called a keyword field. But in the end, everything that is spotted in the store should ideally be the result of a conscious effort to get that visibility and to maximize the appeal you can have from anyone seeing your app. And that's basically ASO.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. And so when we're looking at ASO and ASO data, what's the relationship between those concepts?
It's a very broad one, I would say. So on the start is just to say ASO and ASA are going to talk about keywords. The first thing you want to know is, if my goal is to appear in a search result, whether it be organically or through paid ads, the first question you're going to ask is, how many people search for that word every day? But there's more to see than that. There's a question of figuring out what the intent behind a search query may be, identifying trends, opportunities, also how you can find data in terms of what's going to improve your conversion. So yeah, it's very complex. And then there's even the fact that what you target organically is going to have an impact on the price of your bids with how Apple Search Ads is structured.
Yeah, so you've got your kind of your Apple Search Ads data that you're able to curate, and then from your perspective, is the ASO data kind of everything that's not covered within ASA, or do you see it as something slightly different yourself?
I honestly don't differentiate between the two, at least not for the most part. And that's because the App Store doesn't, in reality. One thing that we have found repeatedly, for instance, is that when it comes to how well your app will rank for a specific keyword, the App Store considers, among many criteria, the conversion rate that your app registers for the keyword. And so if you start running search ads, well, if you have a good conversion rate, that's actually a great opportunity to try and improve your organic position. But also if you target a keyword where you will not convert well, if for some reason you were doing fairly okay organically, that could be detrimental. It's rarely the case, but so it does show that in the end, for the store, Apple considers there is search, there is browse, there's referral, but it doesn't differentiate between paid and organic search.
Interesting. Okay, and I think this is one of the kind of key bits that we're going to cover today. And I guess some of this might be new to people. So as I always forget to say at the start, please make use of the Q&A functions. We've got people behind the scenes that can answer any questions Simon and I don't get around to answering today, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. Make them as hard as you like. We will do our absolute best to get through those. So we kind of started to touch on this, and we've spoken around keywords being one of the mechanisms that people use to discover apps. But do you want to just kind of talk a little bit around why it's so important to have kind of these keyword insights for Apple Search Ads?
Of course. So Apple Search Ads has more than search results placements available now. I personally still believe these are the most efficient ones you can get. But I'd say mostly I consider keywords to have two major parts. One is just the acquisition source. It's knowing that if I work for a music app, people searching music are probably in my target. So first thing is just to figure out which keywords are relevant for the app, and that's where something I hope I'll get a chance to talk about a bit later will be how relevancy is something that gets determined in the eyes of the store, and it's not always semantically the same as what we as humans would think. But the other part to keywords, beyond just a question of what kind of traffic can I get from people searching in the store, and Apple has shared over the years that I think 60 or 65% of installs happen after a search. But beyond that sort of pure acquisition side, there's also the fact that keywords are actually a reflection of user intent. What people search for can tell you a lot about them. And that's where I think it's really interesting to think of keywords not only as the end goal of how to set up the campaign, but also as a study opportunity to understand user intent, user behaviors, and improve overall whether you're marketing or even your product.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's the keyword piece isn't just around how to get more out of Apple search ads, it's actually how to get more out of your app itself as well. And if people are looking for features that you might not have, that's a clear kind of growth opportunity for your app. People might be kind of coming into this going, if you've got all these things that you've got to kind of take account for, surely choosing keywords becomes very, very difficult, or choosing good keywords becomes very, very difficult. So how do you think users go best about selecting their keywords? Where do they start?
So usually the start, if we go old school, the start would be just brainstorming a list of keywords that I expect to be interesting. And in my experience, it leads to a lot of brand names being thrown in the mix. But then that's where various ASO tools like AppTweak, but not the only one, also come in to help. And that's because there you're going to be able to find information such as the volume of traffic associated to the keyword. So that's actually provided directly by Apple, but in the search ads console, it's not that easy or user-friendly to get to it. So that to me is usually the first data point we look at. First, you just need to come up with keywords, but when you start thinking, I want to choose the right ones, 95% of time, at least, the first thing to look at is volume. The second one to look at is going to be the competitiveness of the keyword. So you can look into already organically how many apps are actively targeting that keyword. And then also on the search ad side, is this a keyword that's being heavily bid on? And starting a campaign can also very quickly help you have an idea of how much you need to pay per install on that keyword. The last one is the one I started mentioning, which is relevancy. And this is where at AppTweak, relevancy is actually a metric we calculate based on all of the keywords that are tracked in our tool and all of the apps that are ranked for every single keyword in every single language that we monitor. So that's a big amount of data, but it helps confirm when two keywords or even an app and a keyword are semantically close to each other. Even when there's not necessarily an effort to target the word itself. And sometimes it's also realizing that a word is not what we expect it to be. So the example I love to give for that one is how run and running are a lot more different in the eyes of the App Store than in our eyes. And that's because in the eyes of the App Store, run is actually about games where a character runs. So it's Minion Rush, Temple Run, Subway Surfers, etc. Whereas running is about the physical outdoor activity and all of the run tracking app you can find out there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example of that. I mean, when I talk to customers and we talk about relevancy, the way I kind of simplify it is often down to what is the probability that a client seeing your result is to click on it, because that's the intention of the App Store. But I guess when you're looking outside of that on a broader ASO piece, relevancy takes on a slightly broader meaning. And so it's quite interesting to see kind of you started to develop capability deliberately targeted at that. When you say you kind of look at things in terms of their semantic relevance, semantics is a fairly technical concept. Have you got a kind of simplified version for people that aren't familiar with what semantics mean?
I would try to say semantics is basically what the operator thinks it means. So what makes semantics different in the App Store and between you and I? It's just that the operator in the App Store is an algorithm, and the algorithm doesn't speak to us directly. It's not trained like ChatGPT is to literally predict what the next word would be. No, in the App Store, semantics are going to be, I get like the algorithm is receiving a word and has to come up with apps that relate to it. And so a good amount of how it's going to work is going to say, well, let me look at what other people have liked when I suggested apps to them. And so that's how, for another example of how it can be different, Lime to human beings, at least until recently, would have only been a fruit. But in the App Store, Lime is a scooter app. And it's getting more popular, so maybe more people are now used to thinking, oh yes, of course. But that's a kind of slight shifts. And what's really interesting when I was talking about studying behaviors is that for the very most part, semantics in the App Store are very close to human semantics, but there are these edge cases. And there's also other cases where we can just see how sometimes it's exactly what we mean, but there's more than one way of thinking about the word. And that's where I love to investigate brown power, because what's very interesting with brown power is that when you have none, you just want to get it, because obviously people will, well, the highest volumes in terms of searches, I was checking that about an hour ago, and out of the first 100 most searched keywords in the US in the past few months, I counted only 6 that you could argue are not bronze right now. So bronze tend to be this thing which are supposedly locking a word to mean one specific app. But what I find really interesting is that when you reach a very high brown power, then suddenly your brand starts defining not just your app, but other apps that look like it or offer similar capabilities. And so back a few years ago, Scrabble, there was no Scrabble Go game, but Scrabble was already a very popular term, because when people were thinking about word games, that would be one word they already had in mind. And so that's where, again, looking into these questions of semantics and relevancy are going to push your expectations to a new level, because suddenly some brands may become more interesting as a situation where people will search for that, even if they're willing to be swayed to something different. And in others, there's a very clear cut about this is a market leader, but this is also what people expect and nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful point. And I think one of the other things to be conscious of, you kind of touched on it lightly, is kind of person-to-person language, and the semantics around that are very different to how people enter search phrases into the App Store, or how people enter search phrases into Google versus how they enter them into an App Store. As we've said, they're very intent driven, but people will just write the term run. People don't tend to write what is the top running app, like you might do if you were using Google as an example. So it's quite important to put yourself in the mind of the user and think about the intent, but also think about how that's actually reflected within searching behaviors within the App Store. And I guess the key to this is being able to track that end user behavior. So one of the bits I know we wanted to kind of touch on is how do you get under the skin of user intent in the App Store to kind of reveal these relevant search terms. So that might be a kind of useful bit to kind of touch on now, Simon.
Of course. To me, there's mainly 2 ways to do that. one which is the most conventional, but really always feels underrated in the end, is just looking at user reviews. Like, best way to know what users want is to look at what they say they want. Sometimes they may not say everything, but if you have to start somewhere, start in your user reviews, also expand to your competitors' reviews. And there are some gold mines in there. There's also a lot of noise, so don't expect it to be extremely easy, but there are some really good insights you can make that can help you shift how you present your app. The product may be the same, but sometimes it's just in how you highlight a specific feature that you can find very good insights there. And then the other way of looking under the hood, if you may, to me, is to actually complete the same search in the store. Just look at what are the current results and try to find a trend. And some trends will be uniform. Everyone speaks only about the same thing. Some trends will actually show there are different things expected. And that's also where we start eventually having people rarely searching more than 2 or 3 words, but still like at least going one more word into the search bar. Because with music, which is my pet peeve coming from Deezer, most people from music are going to first look for an app where they can listen to music. So it's going to be essentially music streaming and music players. But you have some potential outliers if you were to say this is everything, because in the mix you'll also have Shazam for music recognition, and you'll also have some DJ apps, even sometimes some music games that may show up and reveal that there's more goings there. And surprisingly, the one thing that I very rarely see on a keyword like that are music learning apps or instrument playing learning apps, basically.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I guess because the popularity of like music tuition apps is generally lower than the big music streaming apps, they tend to require 2, 3, 4 word search terms before you can really elicit those from the search results. But I guess that's where it becomes important to understand that you wouldn't necessarily want to be competing with the keyword music because you're going to be competing with the big streaming services, and that could become quite an expensive avenue, and instead focusing on where there is a more intent-driven section of the market around music tuition, learning to play music, whatever that might be.
Yeah, and I would say definitely if your goal is just to find people who are already very specific about searching for your product, that's the kind of research you want to make. And at the same time, one other thing that's always very funny about ASO in that sense is you can flip the question over and then start thinking, well, maybe I have people who don't know about my product, but who are who may be interested if they knew, and then suddenly the reason for an app that helps you learn to play the piano and will bid on music may not be to get the most install at the lowest cost per install possible, but rather to say, I'm going to do brand awareness using Apple Search Ads.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And I guess from your experience, the nature of whether people are very brand focused or what we would call generic term focused is very dependent on category. How do you, again, how would you go about kind of identifying which is the best avenue for you to explore?
I think that's where you want to be doing quite a lot of research, But in here, I think it's all about balancing the question of what can you do as a marketer, like what are the resources available to you, comparing that to a benchmark of peers. And sometimes it's not too easy to identify your peers because you may be competing with apps that you wouldn't say are direct competitors. But I would say that the approach in here is probably to both look at what's the like how many different keywords are there that have, let's say, volume above 20. For anyone who's less familiar, volume is usually rated between 5 and 100. So saying, okay, let's try to make sure I only look at keywords that will have a certain volume, and then at the same time look at what's the opportunity to challenge the apps that rank well in these categories. So for instance, looking at how many overall downloads do these apps make, not just from the specific word search, but as a whole, because we also know that the overall popularity of the app is a core driver for where it sits in the rankings.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of looking at that. And if you don't have access to an ASO tool, Apple provides their search popularity score, which is a bit of a proxy for that. So you get in effect a score between 1 and 5. It's all scaled between 1 and 100, but yeah, you would choose, say, anything that's got more than 2 out of 5 dots and use that as your measure. And I think one of the bits that's really, really important to cover, and I want to make sure we get a chance to have a brief conversation about today, is getting good organic performance isn't just about ensuring that you're able to get more downloads of your app or whatever it is that you're trying to target, but it actually can make your Apple search ads cheaper to run. We've seen examples of it being able to lower bid prices. I don't know if you've got anything you can kind of expand from your experience on that, Simon.
Yeah, so I would say there's 2 things. One is just if you're not doing any ASO or and specifically any keyword optimization, is just to look at what are the keywords where you're already having good performances in search ads, and look for ways to just incorporate them in your metadata in a way that doesn't feel too obvious or too forced, because that simple act can serve as a signal for Apple's algorithms that your app's relevancy score for a given keyword has improved, and that could help especially scale the amount of downloads you get from that campaign. The other is using custom product pages. So Apple's, I guess, not latest thing anymore, but still something very recent. It's a very great tool overall. It's this tool that allows you to basically build a custom landing page within the App Store, and you can tie a specific Apple Search Ads campaign to that. So one very easy way to explain it is to say, if you have a fitness app which offers advice in terms of dieting, but also programs for workouts. Until we had custom product pages, there were a few tricks to still manage with Apple Search Ads, but overall it was a bit clunky to make sure those looking for dieting keywords would find an app that clearly shows the dieting part and the dieting features. And those looking for workouts also got to see what they wanted first. This is literally what custom product pages can help you with. And so to tie it back to also things we've discussed before, when we talked about finding intent in user reviews, one story I can share is that with one of our clients, we actually started by doing a deep dive in their user reviews and found that people were being very positive about one specific feature that they had available for free, whereas most of their competitors would gate that feature behind a paywall. And so we came up with this custom products page to hide the fact that it was free. And we used that custom products page on campaigns targeting competitors' brands. And we got an increase of the conversion rate of that campaign by 58%.
Wow.
And literally that meant that more installs at the same price, or at the same spend, I should say, dropped the cost per install, I think, by around 30 or 40%.
That's amazing.
It was a tremendous win, and we were extremely happy to see how you could tie everything back together.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I know we could chat a long time about custom product pages, but I mean, fundamentally, they're a mechanism to ensure that you're persisting that user intent down the whole process. Because if you've gone so far as to get them potentially interested in your app, and then from their point of view, it doesn't appear relevant, even though from an algorithmic point of view, it might be relevant, that's where you can see drop-offs in your conversion rate. And that's where custom product pages are a really good way, as Simon said, when you've got a diverse range of feature offerings, to make sure that you're able to reflect what a user is seeing in that sense. And I know we've talked a lot about user intent, semantics, and a lot of this kind of is I guess, touching on a very broad topic area called natural language processing, I guess, is the technical kind of overarching terminology for a lot of this. And I know you've started to do some work around that within AppTweak as well. And it might be useful. I know these sessions aren't about selling products, but I think it's a really cool thing that you guys have been working on, to just give us a little bit of a talk about what it is you've been doing with NLP, I guess, at AppTweak as well.
I wish I could bring in our head of data science to give a more scientific explanation, but I think I can mostly speak as to how we ended up doing it and what makes it extremely exciting and challenging. And it's because the idea we had at first was that we wanted to create some sort of Rosetta Stone between keywords and apps, and how well keywords matched apps, because we know that these are the two largest amount of data points you can find about any app store in the end. We could and we may look to add more about featurings in the future, but when you have to start somewhere, just knowing that the primary function of the store is to get a user to match with an app through search first means that we felt like the keywords were the translation between user intent and product. And so our data science team worked on algorithms that would try to represent what a keyword is and what an app is and what it would be, and using machine learning. So in the end, I can't talk too much as to how exactly it's done, but in the end, what they ended up getting instead of a Rosetta Stone was actually more of a map, and it was just this visual representation of this app is very close or very far from that keyword, and multiply it by the amount of apps and the amount of keywords we track, and already you can start you can start measuring a few different things that make a lot of sense for the most part. So you can just look at what are the closest keyword from our initial keyword, or what are the closest app to one app that we want to study, and so on. And so we've had a couple of features added to the AppTweak tool as a result of that. The relevancy score to me is the one I use most, but I know that we also have options to help people just generate lists of keywords that could be relevant for them very quickly. We are also able to group apps together in a much more detailed ways in what the store does, because today in the store you just select your category and then you end up having very different types of games, for instance, that are all listed under casual or simulation, which I think are two of the most popular game categories.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, and sometimes you do find an outlier that makes a lot of sense to a human, but that until you start looking at this method of classifying app with NLP, wouldn't be there. And that to me is the perfect example is YouTube. YouTube is listed under photo and video, I believe. But when we started making our clusters, we saw that YouTube is actually an entertainment app. It's much closer to Netflix and Disney Plus than it would be to a photo editor. And that makes a lot of sense. But if you just look at the initial data without knowing how they connect to each other, that's not information you would see. And so where I'll leave with a topic by fear of becoming too nerdy is that I think right now the way we see it is to say we've just created the first map that you can find, and now we have to build the GPS, because that's what comes next in the innovation cycle.
No, I think that's a really good way to kind of round that off. And I think for anyone that's kind of interested, ChatGPT is another example of natural language processing. And I guess at a very basic level, from my perspective, what you're basically doing is you're taking a set of words and somehow you've got to translate that into a set of numbers that represent those words. So that might be that the word AppTweak is always preceded by the word the, or it's always followed by the word and, or it frequently appears with the word Belgium because that's where it's hosted, because that's where the company is. And you're building up all of these characteristics about it. And then when you've kind of done that at a huge scale, what the machine learning is then there to do is to help add some structure and understand where the patterns exist in that data in a way that wouldn't necessarily be that feasible for a person to do it. And that's how you then kind of get these giant maps of, you see then there's connections between the word YouTube and the word Netflix. Okay, why is there a relationship between those words? So you'll hear people talking about semantic webs and semantic maps, and that's what a lot of this stuff is. It's a really fascinating field, and we could go into it into a lot of detail, but we won't today. But I do encourage you to read about it because it is becoming an increasingly prevalent area and something people are increasingly aware of with the likes of ChatGPT now. So we've got kind of a few minutes left. So one of the last bits is I'd always like to do a bit of kind of future thinking. Whilst I'm doing that with Simon, we have got a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So please do shove something in the Q&A box. Otherwise, you'll get my questions. So Simon, what's next steps, I guess, for ASO, Apple Search Ads? What are the opportunities there?
That's a tough one, but I think what we already touched on about user insights, how to how to cross-reference insights you may have from ASO, from ASA, from other sources, and just tie it all together at the overall marketing level. And then how do you dive back down to the operational stage, and like which inventories should you go after in ASA, for instance. I think the other is still custom product pages. Being able to tailor your message to different campaigns is a tremendous opportunity to improve your conversion rates. But it's also going to be a way to not just leverage the insights you have, but create more. I think one thing I started hearing a lot more about in the past few months is people now also turning a lot to questions around web to app. And so in here, I think there's an opportunity once you've built your first custom product pages for search ads and are seeing good engagement there, to also look at other funnels that could link to the same custom product page, so that you can expand the way you present your app and get more people converted, not just from search ads, but from all across your marketing mix.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. So kind of a question I think would be, hopefully people would find helpful to get an answer to, is ASO isn't a one-time task. It's not something you do when you create your app and never do it again. When you're talking to clients, do you have general recommendations of how frequently you should look to review your kind of ASO metadata?
I like, before I answer, I just want to say, I like the fact that you asked the amount of like, how frequently should you review? Because I think that's also where I see a lot of unnecessary controversy around the ASO. Is that a lot of people will tell you that, oh, I did it once, it was great, and then I kept doing it and I didn't get the same gains. And that's because if your product doesn't evolve much, then your ASO may not need to change too often. However, it doesn't mean you shouldn't review frequently. And that's because stores update their algorithms quite frequently. Sometimes they even update the UI, and suddenly certain things are going to work differently. It's going to shift where your app appears, how it appears, how well you convert. And so I tend to say, if you want to do it in a data-driven way, even though it can be tempting to change keywords every week or every few days, I'd rather give it, let's say, months most times. If I have the bandwidth to look to do a review before that, maybe I will, but I also know that a lot of us have a lot of things to monitor at the same time. But so reviewing on a monthly to bi-monthly basis to me is sort of the standard healthy thing to do. And then don't feel like you have to change something every time you review, but also don't be afraid to go trial and error. I mean, ASO is an iteration game, and that's because the way we build products is also iterative. And in that sense, yeah, I think that's the main notion is, whenever something changes and you know something changed, for sure you should review. If you're able to, try to have regular reviews, because you never know when a competitor may start doing something and suddenly have an impact on what you're doing. But at the very least, never think it's just upload your app and let it be, because that leads to a lot of nightmares, to be honest.
Brilliant, thanks, Simon. I think the only thing I would add is don't forget to review user intent changes as well. If the way people are searching for your type of app changes, then that's another reason for updating your metadata. But I think sadly we have to draw the conversation to an end there. Chloe, if you want to reach out afterwards, I'm sure one of us can answer your question. Big thanks to Simon for joining. Really appreciate the time. That was a massively insightful conversation. As always, we will be providing a recording of the session on YouTube in the next couple of days, so please feel free to share that, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.